Thank you, Professor Saab. It's such a thank you for inviting me to share my thoughts with the bright students who have enrolled today, especially interested in pursuing a career in foreign policy. As we always say, that the whole objective of the diplomacy is to serve the national interest. The national interest of a country is defined by the government of the day in general, but very often there is a continuity of sorts. It also depends on the kind of challenges that they face internationally, globally, and regionally. So therefore, we work in the bilateral context, we work in the regional context, and we work in the multilateral context. So when you try to understand the foreign policy or a diplomacy of a country, you will have to look at the country's requirements from the international or the global world order. Today, unfortunately, we are going through a global disorder. It is not an order at all. A pandemic has further accentuated it. We have the newer poles that have come out with the disintegration of the Soviet Union in 1991. The Cold War was said to have ended, but the Cold War traits which were there, that was decimating the competition, having an equal and opposite reaction to everything, has continued. And in fact, that role now is being taken, and once again, the world is moving towards more of a kind of a bipolar, or somewhat we can say multipolarity, means several poles there. But the only thing that is common now is conflict is common, cooperation is becoming less, protectionism has increased tremendously everywhere, multilateral institutions are becoming increasingly ineffective, and therefore the problem for countries like India is exactly how to move forward in its quest for peace, development, and creating friendships without getting into the troubles. Now, that is a major objective of the Indian foreign policy. I'm hearing some disturbance somewhere. I hope if they can.
Please mute your audios. Mute your audios, all participants.
Yeah. As I say, that we do not live in a vacuum. So whatever happens in one part of the world impacts us. So in my view, it's a simplistic view, but I see that C square A, as I say, China, Corona, and America are the real problems today, or roots of many problems in the world. Wherever you will see, you will find their hand in it. Superpower rivalries have often kept the world hostage on very many important issues, including climate change, which is a very, very major concern for the world, as well as multilateralism. We have seen the helplessness of the UN at 75. You just heard the Secretary General of the UN in connection with the Russia-Ukrainian crisis, when in the end he simply said, in the name of humanity, I beseech you, please withdraw your troops to Putin. So it shows that nothing happens. In the Security Council, nothing happens because of the way it has been constituted. India has been trying very hard to acquire its rightful place in the Security Council so that there is an expansion. And when it was made in 1945, it was the deal between victor and the vanquished. So the countries who had won in the war acquired special status for themselves through the veto procedures. And that the veto has actually kept for the peace from prevailing across the world. And that has also given rise to greater unilateralism, which we have seen in Iraq invasion, we have seen in Libya, we have seen in different parts of the world, and today we are also seeing in Ukraine. So we have, during, although 75 years have passed, it has done many things. So when it comes to smaller countries, weaker countries, everybody pounces on them. But when it comes to the bigger countries, the most powerful countries, then everything is a stalemate, and they between themselves decide how the world order is going to be divided, how things are going to work, who will be in my sphere of influence, and that is where most of the problems come. And so countries like India, which are hoping to graduate to a developed economy, hoping to become stronger regionally, internationally, have a sane voice, find that kind of a problem while dealing with these kinds of things. So we have seen during Trump's era, because USA is said to be the one who had initiated these institutions, all these, whether it is Bretton Woods institutions for the financial, like World Bank and IMF, you may have heard, or the UN organizations, or the World Health Organization, even during the pandemic, or World Trade Organization, which regulates the global trade. In all these, we have seen USA withdrawing from it. So if the most powerful country, which claims to be a liberal democracy, wants to withdraw from the multilateral institutions, you can immediately understand the plight of the global governance structures. And that is exactly the thing when we see what happened during the pandemic. We have seen that the countries who had the power to help fight this, even if China was said to be the creator of this Wuhan virus, the other countries like the Americans, who have of course faced a lot of trouble, Europeans and everybody, they started hoarding the vaccine. They would not palm it off to the weaker countries in Africa or elsewhere. In that sense, we have seen that India, which is for the first time in a quick period, we developed several vaccines. We even not only developed our own, but we had also been manufacturing vaccines from different countries, including AstraZeneca, as you know, and they started providing to a very large number of countries. Even before the vaccines happened, India started providing relief supplies, medical supplies to over 150 countries. And not only that, after the independence, you must have heard that we followed the principle of non-alignment. Non-alignment was basically judging issues on their merit without taking side of one bloc or the other bloc, or benefit from both. It did help in a great extent to a large number of countries, because most of the countries in the 40s, 50s, 60s, when they were liberated from the yoke of colonialism, obviously they were worried about it. They didn't want to go back to the same countries or under their influence. And that is the reason many of them chose to side with Soviet Union or Russia. So these countries continued to expand and fight with one another till the Cuban crisis of 1962 happened, and we saw what happened. But at that time, India was fighting its own war with China, which becomes its very major problems. So what we are seeing is that the geopolitical changes are taking place, new political alliances and alignments between and among the countries are taking place. There is a mushrooming of very many plurilateral arrangements. When I say plurilateral, that means organizations like, you must have all heard the name of BRICS. You must have heard the name of Quad. So those are the kind of organizations we are talking about. In the economic domain, we see various regional trading arrangements, like, ASEAN, about NAFTA, about, again, the BRICS also is largely economic. In this, G20 is another economic organization. European Union, you hear about that. SAARC in our region, you know about that. So these are all there. But over time, what has happened is you want to fight against protectionism, which is being imposed by the mighty countries. And how do you do that? You can do it by being together, especially the developing countries. And that is the role Indian diplomacy played during the non-alignment era and even today in the international domain. So what we try to do is we try to project the voice and concerns of a very large number of developing countries, since 90% of them constitute that. And therefore, this remains our major challenge and the major task of India. And that's why acceptability of India across the world is very, very significant. Now, we are also going through another challenge. And that challenge is that we had missed second and third industrial revolutions when they happened at that time, because we were colonial. We could not make the benefit. But we carried on with the knowledge revolution and caught up in the 80s, 90s, and since then. So today, consequently, India's economy, the largest portion of the economy is neither manufacturing nor agriculture, but the services that constitute about 60+% of the overall GDP of India, which is also a sign of a developed country, as you know. So India provides a very mixed picture of a developing country, sometimes poorer areas, but at the same time also very heavily developed in that sense. So now that the Industrial Revolution 4.0, you all must have heard, is coming along, or started already, it is very important that new technologies, artificial intelligence, all these we are able to have an access to. So the diplomacy has also changed into something called techno diplomacy. So that will become our major challenge in today's world. Apart from the hello, that apart from so apart from yeah, so apart from the traditional diplomatic practices that we engage in, we need to continue to work on something which are the new challenges that are coming up in our in front. So we have to, and very often you must be hearing that there is a technology denial. And therefore, when we look at something called Atmanirbhar Bharat, and you know, the pandemic has come as a blessing somehow also, because it has exposed the vulnerabilities of the world, major powers, and every other country, like including India. So we have seen that India has launched this Atmanirbhar Bharat campaign. Now, this Atmanirbhar Bharat campaign essentially is trying to manufacture in India for which will provide you lesser reliance on other countries. You know, we are the pharmacy of the world, but being the pharmacy of the world, we still import 70 to 80% of the APIs from China. So if you're dependent on China, you cannot produce and become what you want to become. Likewise, for the vaccines, you need inputs from 36 countries, including China. Rare earths that you need for moving forward to the next stage, you need it from China. Now, if you have your relations with China are not good, or they're going to be a challenge, so therefore, a new methodology has to be developed so that new equations with new countries. So diplomacy's job is to identify opportunities for the country, identify reliable mechanisms, reliable institutional arrangements, so that what your country is trying to achieve is done. And that's what the Indian diplomacy has been trying to do. For that, what is very important is peace, development, multilateralism. All these become instruments in your quest for achieving your own self-sufficiency, acquiring your own, to serve your own national interests, whatever they are. So this is something we have to, this is what the Indian diplomacy does. Now, as I said, that we are not living in a vacuum. That means we have an evolving world order. We have the problems in our immediate neighborhood. We have the problems in our extended neighborhood like West Asia. We have a problem with China. We have a challenge with Pakistan. We have the competing world powers there. So how has India played out its hand? And that's what I will try to talk in next 5-10 minutes. And after that, I will be very happy to answer any of your questions, because I think that that is a better way of understanding what is really happening. So we try to balance. Now, when I say that, let me start with our neighbors. You see, neighbors are not your choice. Neighbors are a necessity. They are a gift of geography. You have to live with them. You have to work with them. You have to grow with them. India has followed a policy that our neighbors who were actually culturally connected to us, especially in the SAARC region, we can say, they are the ones, if they grow, they become stronger economically, then it is good for us. Then India, which is the largest economy, a big country with big army, with everything, can become a global player. But if you get stuck and bogged down into your regional problems, it will be extremely difficult for India to step out of this kind of a situation. And that's what China wants India to remain embroiled into this region. And that is why it has started showing greater interest in our neighborhood and providing them loans, debts, and all kinds of projects, including something called string of pearls strategy, means all the naval bases, naval establishments in those countries, making them virtually dependent on them. So this has become a major challenge. Now, when India does it, how does it do it? It believes in non-reciprocity. Means when we are giving you something, it is not equal. It is that we are expecting for anything from you. If we are providing 90% market access for your products, that is to allow your industry to grow. If we are providing you lines of credit to develop, that is for you to grow your strength. What is India seeking in return? Not the markets. What India is seeking in return is that India's security concerns are respected, are somehow those countries should not allow anti-India stances, organization to take place. And this is a problem that we are facing with Pakistan. India always believed that a stronger, economically stronger Pakistan is also in India's favor. But with Pakistan, we have been a part of the same country, but we have also had this problem of religious divide on which the country was made. But that was broken very fast in 1971 when another country was created. So the religious basis of that is gone. Moreover, India has become the second largest Muslim nation of the world. And even though we are a secular country, as per the constitution, I think personally that India, being the second largest Muslim nation, should use this as an advantage, as an Islamic card to inform people. And you won't believe it. I was shocked when during my interactions with many of the Arab countries who did not know that India is the second largest Muslim nation. They believed that Pakistan was the one, and Pakistan encashed it, and we continued to sit back and wait for things. And our relationship, especially with the Middle Eastern countries, whom we call as our extended neighborhood, remained transactional, buyer-seller. We buy oil, we pay them. They import things, they pay us. They employ Indians, millions of them, they're there. But it is the most important region from your perspective. And that is that you need energy security. So most of your oil and gas comes from there, 70, 80%. You need food security. Although food security means that we are importing all our fertilizers and phosphates and potash from these countries. And that is why it is extremely important from our point of view. You need the welfare, the diaspora welfare. 8-9 million people are there whose security is of utmost concern to you at any given time. So if there is a trouble in that region, obviously you are going to suffer. Today, like you must be reading the news that 20,000 Indians are stuck in Ukraine. See, the whole of government of India is trying to just safely evacuate them. Think of a situation, if there is a war in the Middle East, how would we do that? That 8 million people, how do you bring them back? How do you provide them assistance? That is the kind of situation that we always face. Then those countries also have their internal problems. So we have to deal with in such a way. Now, Saudi Arabia and and Iran have had a big fight. Iran and Israel had a big fight. Then you had UAE, Egypt, all those countries, then the Qatar. You know, there are a lot of these countries have their internal problems and keep fighting. To maintain relations with them, each one individually, is not an easy task. But India has done so. India has individually maintained relations with every country, including with Iran, that has been under tremendous sanctions from the United States. And that's why in the beginning, when I say the problem of the world is C square A. So China is there, Corona is there, America is there. Now, America imposes sanctions, unilateral sanctions that are not imposed by the United Nations, and expects every other country to follow them. And that's why it stopped India from importing oil from Iran. So you have to somehow, but still we have been able to manage this relationship from completely falling apart. It has come very handy now. It has come handy in the context of Afghanistan when there was a major problem there. So what are we looking at is that we have good relations, trying to individually have good relations with our neighbors. We have succeeded somehow, sometimes we have not succeeded. What has happened is that the bigger player there is China. Now China has heavy pockets. It can pump in money, it can execute the projects faster, it can be present very, very quickly. So India has begun to match up to that, even though we don't wish to invest to the extent that China does. But India has a very different approach to it, which is not indebting those countries. And that's what they understand. And that's the reason. But over time, as you know, after all, they are very similar to us in our culture and civilizational heritage. So those countries have developed some kind of negotiability advantage. Today, they want to benefit from India's largest, what India is giving, and they want to talk to China and get what is coming from China. They personally do not want to get involved into the problems of India and China. But by virtue of being a part of it, by virtue of their strategic location, they obviously become into that. And that's when you often hear India is having problem with Nepal sometimes with Sri Lanka on the fishing boats, sometimes with Bangladesh. But relations overall, I would say, have been moving in a more positive trajectory. Now, same thing in West Asia, we have done very well. Now, relationship from a transactional perspective, it has switched to a strategic dimension. And when it has moved to the strategic dimension, that is when the things have begun to look very differently. Earlier, they used to look at India from the Pakistani prism. But today, they look at India as a great opportunity for themselves also. That is the reason they are beginning to invest greatly into India. You must have heard, we recently signed a comprehensive economic partnership agreement with UAE. We have same kind of relations with Saudi Arabia, with Iraq, Kuwait, with all of the countries. No doubt they are important for energy security, but today they are increasing their stakes in India. And that is something that is important from our perspective for a long-term relationship. You know, earlier, if you wanted a fugitive who had gone to Middle East, in Dubai or elsewhere, it was impossible to get them back. But today, they are the fastest. Unlike Malayas or that diamond people in different countries, anytime these countries are very quickly growing. It was impossible to talk to them on counterterrorism cooperation. Or because when you talk of counterterrorism cooperation, you have to talk of Pakistan, because Pakistan is using terrorism as an instrument of its foreign policy. So therefore, you have to work with them. And that's what they have begun to understand and appreciate India's position a great deal than it was otherwise. Now, let us move to our relations with European Union. I would go, and later on I will come to China and US and Russia, because which is playing out right now. So European Union, as you know, is
mute yourself. Rakesh, mute yourself. Mute yourself.
Yeah. So with the European Union, we have had very good relations. It has been one of the biggest union in which 27 countries are the members, and it's the largest market at one time. But it is also a very difficult market. So that's why when you talk to the European Union, you talk to a labyrinthine bureaucracy. And when you want to enter into the markets there, it is not an easy thing. But it is easy in one way, because they have uniform standards. And when they have uniform standards, so if you comply with them, then you will be easily in one market you enter, you can go across 27 countries. So we have been trying to work with them, not only for this, but also to start some kind of a free trade agreement with European Union. That has been hanging fire for quite some time now. Then in addition, we also have good bilateral relations with each country there. We don't have any problem with any of the European countries as far as our bilateral relations are concerned. Like France, UK, and others are also our defense partners. They are also our strategic partners separately. Germany, for that matter, is very important from our perspective. So we are trying to work with them, those countries, trying to attract investments from them into India, which has been happening. Also to import technology from these countries, collaborate with them in R&D and other things. This is what the diplomacy does it and has done it very, very successfully. So we are looking at European Union. I think this, we have mechanisms, umpteen number of mechanisms to cooperate and collaborate with these countries. But at the same time, we find that very often they are still quite protectionist. So the job of the diplomat is also to identify those protectionist measures and try to remove them through dialogue and discussions through the various mechanisms that we have with them. Then Latin America, we have been rather late in going, I would say. Although Prime Minister Modi has gone there, he has been, I mean, during under this government, we have seen there are tremendous outreach which has been conducted by Prime Minister and various of the ministers, President and Vice President, which is a good thing, because see, high-level diplomacy today is the need of the hour. This is how the diplomacy is being conducted at the highest level today. Very often, even economic diplomacy for that matter, is done at the level of the Prime Minister and the leaders of those countries. So the visits provide that opportunity to touch upon the most sensitive and important aspects in which a country, or India for that matter, is focusing. So that's what is important from our point of view, and that's what we do. Likewise, in Latin America, we are now beginning to catch up. I remember many years ago, we had tried some new paradigm, and that was every country, we'll have 5 countries and 5 products to focus on. But now that strategy has moved forward, and gradually we are seeing a much greater engagement with the big country. Brazil, of course, has been close to us because it is part of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa grouping. It is also a part of IMSA, India, Brazil, and South Africa group. So we are involved with them. Then Argentina is also quite close. Now, Chile and several other countries are showing greater interest. Indian government has recently also started working on small island nations in the South Pacific and other places. Now that is something, they're small islands, so giving them a lot of assistance and providing them information about India, capacity building assistance. This is helping. Now you'll be surprised that since 1964, India has started this something called Indian Technical, Economic and Cooperation Program. Now that program was there for the developing countries like us. So idea was, whatever expertise we have, whatever resources we have, we would believe to share and care with you. So the share and care philosophy started, and India today provides assistance to over 160 plus countries through the ITEC program. Now that is something amazing, because that gives you a tremendous goodwill, that creates a constituency for you in that country. When I went to Latvia, the foreign minister there took me for a little round in the building of the foreign office. And he said, in every room of this office, you will find a diplomat who has been to India and trained in India. Now, you can imagine if they are exposed to such a thing, then it makes so much difference. When I was in Mongolia, I mean, we were initially, the government had given us only 2 slots. But because of certain reasons, and my ambassador, who was a Buddhist monk, his presence and approach to the Prime Minister and all, we got an open-ended supply of scholarships. Today, you know, Mongolia, which is so important, lying between Russia and China, is our spiritual and third nation. And that's how they call India. That's one country where Indians are really loved. And so you can create so much of goodwill, and you are able to move the relationship. And that's what the Indian diplomacy has done. For Africa, we had an ad hoc policy. Nobody was going. After Prime Minister Nehru, who went most of the African countries, we did not have any visits of our leaders to other parts of Africa, except to South Africa, which was one country, which was basically a Western country in many senses. But fortunately, our new Africa policy under Prime Minister Modi has really taken off, and I hats off to him in that sense, that they have focused on Africa from top. We have created more diplomatic missions. When I was in Africa, from one country, I was covering 5 or 6 countries. It becomes increasingly difficult to do that. But today we are decided to have 18, 20 more missions. We are having India-Africa Forum summits, which provides all the leaders from those countries come and meet, project their requests, demands, and everything. Of course, we have started changing our policy. Then Prime Minister Modi called something called 10 guiding principles. I think you can see it on the websites. What are those 10 guiding? But the essence of those is the changing reality of the times. But the basic essence is that Africa for Africans, whereas every other country is trying to exploit them in one way or the other. And every single, like in India, we have had the Dutch, we had the British, we had the French, we had Portuguese. Likewise, in Africa, was portioned by all these colonial powers at the time. So they mistrust them. China has put them into the dead diplomacy. But India is now catching up. And I think we will have to do a much better job and much faster in that to deliver what they are asking for. But at least now we have a policy ambit, we have a resolve, and we are doing that. So that's something in Africa which requires a much greater focus, because in my view, the second half of this century will be the Afro-Asian century. We could have become an Asian century, but because of the problem between India and China, I see that already 22 years have gone by in this century, and the conflict has not seen the end of the day. So now coming to international organizations, before I touch the other 3 countries. The international organizations, as I said earlier, we have been the founding members of the United Nations. We have been founding members of GATT and WTO. We have been the founding members of World Health Organizations, UNESCO, and all the major organizations. But after we expect, we have been playing an international role even when we were weak. We were very strong internationally at that time. And we are getting there once again in that field. Countries look up to you, not because you are a big military power, but because you have somewhat principled approach and you are looking for a larger good, a global good. That was very clearly evident during India's vaccine diplomacy or the medicine diplomacy that we undertook recently, or for that matter, our capacity building assistance that we provide to so many large number of countries in the world. Now, India expects to become a part of the expanded UN Security Council. We have been leading it from the front. Many of you would not know that when the Universal Principles United Nations was passing, it was written men. All men are equal. This was changed to include women as well by an Indian lady who was our representative at the time, Hansa Mehta. So India has contributed a great deal and has believed in the world governance systems and governance architecture. But those architectures have been failed by the superpowers, not by India. India still continues to believe in the UN Security Council, into the UNET system. Today, we are part of last 1 year, we have been part of the Security Council the 10th or 11th time. So we have to undertake responsibilities. We have to be forthcoming. We have to bell the cat, as they say, when you are going to play a global role. And that is extremely important from our perspective, as and when we become members of the Security Council as a permanent member, and we claim it. We are not requesting anybody. We claim it because we have been the largest provider of the peacekeepers. We have been the founder member. We are the largest democracy in the world. We have represent 1/6 of the population. So it is criminal to keep India out. And India's track record itself speaks of what it does. So likewise in WTO and everywhere else, India has become the voice of the developing countries. Now non-alignment per se may have lost its traction, which India had launched at the time. But the strategic autonomy, which you are listening very often, also is an extension of that. So when we take a decision as per the objective understanding of an issue, that is what is called your strategic autonomy, that you are not carried away under pressure of one bloc, one group, one country or the other, but you are taking it according to your own requirements. Now, China is a country which has sees India in the zero-sum game. It fears that India being the democracy is a conflict of systems, ideologies, and nearly equal size. In 1980s, we were the same, both the countries. But today, because of economic reforms, because of the help and assistance that was provided to them by the Americans and the West, they have today become the second largest or the first largest economy in the world. Today, the Chinese are trying to change the global order. They want to displace the Americans, the only hyperpower, from taking over, displaced from there. And the Americans want to stop that tide. And this is being taken over in the domain of trade and technology. And that is what whoever will ace in technology will be part of the governing structure in the world. And that's what the Chinese are trying very hard. And in that domain, because they are aiming at displacing USA, although under President Xi Jinping, they have made many mistakes. On the other hand, we have Russia. Russia is the successor state of Soviet Union. And as you know, the Soviet Union and the US-led Western group at that time was into the Cold War. So when the Cold War ended in 1990, the Russians became the largest country. Even today, it is the largest country. But there were 15 other republics that were created, and they became the Council of Independent States, CIS countries they were called, of which Ukraine was also one of the countries. And Ukraine and Russia have been, I would say, umbilically linked. And as President Putin says, that this is in that sense, he has been, he wanted to work with them and be closer to them. But then the geopolitics, look at the geopolitics that is there. What is happening today that we are facing is the Russian invasion, you can say, military action, you may say, whatever it is. But the Russians have been saying that in 1997, when the Berlin Wall fell, they were given to understand that the NATO, which is a security organization, will not expand towards Russia or towards East, as it's called, eastward expansion. That has been the thing. They said that don't do that. There was no need, because countering NATO used to be a Warsaw Pact group countries, which was a security organization. With the dissolution and disintegration of Soviet Union, Warsaw Pact ended. So NATO should have ended, but NATO continued. They said we are a defensive organization. And it continued its expansion. From 16 members, it became 30, taking 14 neighboring countries of Russia into the thing. So which is why the largest country, a powerful country, a declining superpower, but superpower all the same, feels threatened by this expansion. For this, Georgia, Belarus, and Ukraine are the natural borders for its security. They are the buffer states for it. But if Ukraine becomes a member of the NATO, then you have NATO sitting exactly on the borders of Russia, which Russia does not want. Even though you can argue that Ukraine is an independent country, sovereign country, it can make any choices. But the countries that are not that strong also need to see what kind of choices they make so that they don't get stuck between the hard rock and a place. So I believe that that has been the major cause of concern. So when in 2014, before that 2008 in Georgia, Russia tried to secure its borders, tried to create some kind of a security perimeter and convey the message to the Western countries that these are my red lines, please don't cross. But West, as you know, expansionist in its nature and arrogant in its behavior. So obviously they did not care for it. And that's what you're seeing today is a result of not addressing the concerns of the Russian security concerns mainly. And Putin is a strong leader. He doesn't trust the Americans. He doesn't trust anybody. So we are seeing that kind of situation. America, our relations, as you know, are excellent. Today we are into the Quad partnership with Australia, Japan, and USA. It is called a Global Comprehensive Strategic Partnership. With Russia, we have a special and privileged strategic partnership. We are greatly dependent on Russia for our supplies of equipments, defense equipments, nuclear and space. So all these are working fine. We have a great relationship. They have stood by us internationally because you need friends in order to counter the likes of Pakistan and China and others. So as the global dimension changes, the global equations change, you have to adjust your realities. And that's why when the External Affairs Minister says that we are following a policy of multi-alignment, then that is what he means by that. That's the reason. When Prime Minister Modi says that I'll go here, there, wherever I want to, where my national interests are served. So that is what he's trying to say, that national interests are supreme. Now, lastly, I would just mention about diaspora welfare. You know, we have about 30 million Indians living abroad. Their safety, security is, of course, important. Many of them become nationals of those countries. They have become a great bridge for you, for your diplomacy. So diaspora diplomacy is also one of the major factors, because not only do they send about $82–83 billion every year to India, which is nearly, I would say, about 20% or more than that of our 25% of our GDP, our foreign exchange reserves, and therefore they are important for us. So they are with them. Government of India has decided and has been working very closely to bring them on board, whether to access technology, science. They are being used in that dimension. They are helping us reaching out. They have become the building bridges with their countries and those governments to bring India closer to that country and also to serve India's interests. So I think that when I say that India's diplomacy has challenges, it faces challenges in the evolving world order or disorder, as we may call, but at the same time, so far, with certain policies like Vasudhaiv Kutumbakam, as we call it, like world is one family, and we don't even say that. So let me just briefly touch upon the last point, and that is the ongoing crisis and India's vote in that. As some of you may be wondering why India abstained. Number one, India does not believe and support military intervention anywhere. So the history shows every time there has been a case, we have had to abstain. We abstained because of the reason, because the big countries, only America and the US or the NATO, they are the ones who go and intervene wherever they want. But we confront in China, because China is getting into our territory, so we stand up to them. And that's what we have done in Galwan and other places. So here, when we abstained in the United Nations Security Council, which vote resolution was vetoed by Russia, of course, but India has said very clearly a few things. Number one, the cost of lives is very important. So we cannot let the Ukrainians dying or anybody dying. So they were telling both sides that we must minimize the cost. Dialogue and diplomacy must take the precedence. That the way of diplomacy was abandoned too soon. Who was they telling? They were telling to the Russians that you should have abided by diplomacy. Even when Prime Minister Modi spoke to Putin 2 days ago, he told him that please reduce the violence, stop the conflict, come to the table. Now, so today, India has acquired that kind of an heft that it can play a more positive role as an interlocutor, whether it is America, whether it is Russia, whether it is Ukraine, so in the crisis. But of course, as they say, PG Wodehouse says, be a man, bite the bullet. So if you have the will, then only you will be able to do that. Countries are looking up to India's increased and enhanced leadership at the global stage. So I'll stop here, and if there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer those. Thank you so much, Vincent.
Yes, yes, please introduce yourself and be brief in your questions. Come on, be quick. Yes, come on. Although I don't think any aspect of Indian diplomacy and its features, the role played by it, I think you have covered everything. And I think it is very difficult for the students to find questions, to question you. It has been so comprehensive. Yeah,
Thank
come
you.
on.
I think in the chat box, let me see if there is a question. Oh, no.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Sir, first of all, thank you so much for this wonderful session. My name is Pranjal and I am doing a master's in IR from Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi. So my question is, in the last few years, we have mentioned, we have seen the increased conflict, like in the case of Afghanistan and the current Russia-Ukraine crisis. So in both these conflicts, we have seen that UN played a very limited role. Or apart from UN, there are other international organizations which hardly played a role in this. So can we say that despite having all these international organizations, there is still anarchy in the international order?
Yes, Pranjal, this is what precisely I mentioned. The problem of the international or multilateral institutions is when the big powers like US or Russia or China are involved, it is impossible to pass any resolution. It is impossible to take it forward anywhere. That is the biggest problem. And that's why there is you call it anarchy. I think it is anarchy. Anarchy by these countries who are supposed to maintain the global world order. So you're absolutely right. Unless these institutions are reformed thoroughly, I don't think that their relevance will continue. They will remain as a talking shop. They have a good role to play as far as other developing countries are concerned, where interests of these big powers are not directly in conflict. So there you will see, and it is 75 years later, the UN, as I mentioned in the beginning, that UN Secretary General, in fact, instead of seeing that there is a complete block there, today now they have called the UNGA meeting on Ukraine. But this was there. But at the same time, instead of doing anything, he said, I'm pleading with you in the name of humanity. Now, that is the situation. You cannot enforce anything. So unilateralism is becoming the currency for these big powers and has been there for a very long time.
Yes, next question. Yes, come on, be quick.
Good evening. My name is Yashvi and I'm a final year BA student from St. Xavier's College, Mumbai. So, Ambassador, my question is that India has not engaged quite significantly with the Central Asian countries. So, in your view, how do you think that India should engage more with the Central Asian countries, considering our relations with Iran because of sanctions imposed by US? So, the only route to reach Afghanistan is through these Central Asian countries.
Yeah, you are very right. I mean, we did not do it for a very long time. Basically because of the problems in Afghanistan for quite early years. After that, of course, 20 years, we had the Americans present there. So we were continuing to build in Afghanistan. We had good relations with Iran, but they were impacted because of the American sanctions and the various acts that they have brought against the Iranians. So just for 2-3 years, when the Iranians had begun to open at that time the relationship with the Central Asian countries because of the connectivity issue. Central Asia has been part of India's history, as you know. But at the same time, Central Asia is also a backyard of the Russians. And they have borders with Iran, they have borders with China. So the countries that have the border with them, they became part of the BRI network. So India was late in coming in the Central Asia. But in 2012, we started our Central Asia Connect policy, Connect Central Asia policy. And since then, there have been a lot of engagements. When these Central Asian countries were made, I think in 1997, at that time, India was the first country, or 1991, they were the first country to invite all the leaders and recognize them. But physically, because of physical connectivity, the relationship did not move forward. Of course, when the Afghan situation became rather bad, we started reaching out to them. And as you know, Prime Minister Modi went there. And many of them became members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So we are working with them in that context. Recently, the National Security Advisor had invited the National Security Advisor from those countries. Then we also had the foreign ministers of those countries who met with our foreign minister in India. They were present here. Prime Minister Modi wanted to invite all 5 Central Asian leaders to the Republic Day celebration. It could not happen because of the pandemic. So we had a virtual summit between the leaders. Now the connectivity is gradually increasing, and especially in the IT and fintech and other sectors, you can overcome the connectivity. So there is a greater need for doing that much more because they are very important countries. They are resource-rich countries. Like for Turkmenistan, which is a gas-rich country. We have been trying to take the gas from there, natural gas, to India via this line which is called TAPI, like Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. But because of the problem between India and Pakistan, it could not work out. Likewise, in Iran, there is a problem. So it could not. But India has maintained good relations. And you must have heard about Chabahar port. So we have developed the Chabahar port as a strategic port for us to outreach to Afghanistan and to Central Asia. Similarly, these also can be now plugged into the international North-South transport corridor, which we are part of with Russia to go to Europe, particular places. So Iran is very much a part of it. And as you know that when the Iranian new President Raisi was elected, Dr. Jaishankar was the first foreign leader to go and meet with him. So we are trying to mend fences with them, but there is always a limitation when the superpowers have their unilateral sanctions. Because now, as you know, that Russia, they have cut off from the SWIFT. So if they cut off a country from SWIFT, no transactions can take place. So because of that fear, many of the countries don't take that path to do that. But India is now currently in a much better situation as far as Central Asia is concerned. But I agree with you, much more can be done.